Having reviewed the little Vespa 125 in the last video, and so that no one can possibly accuse the channel of lacking variety, I thought this week I'd take a look at its closest competitor, the Diavel V4. Ducati Faro were kind enough to lend me their brand new 2026 V4 for 3 days, and naturally I jumped at the chance. It's loud, it's brutal, and I love it. Yes, okay, enough futile fantasizing about how good this €28,000 bike, 44,000 if you go mad with the option boxes, would look in my garage. What's it like to live with? Engine, brakes, gearbox, comfort, heat, fuel economy, wind protection, practicality? And how does it compare to perhaps its most obvious competitor, the Triumph Rocket? And at the end, I'll look at some of the questions you sent in and let you know whether I'd actually want to own a Diavel. Starting the engine certainly gave me, well, a start. It's loud and the whole bike rocks slightly from the torque reaction as the exhaust gases are ejected from what looks like a rocket launcher behind your right leg. I'm sure that wasn't deliberate. Things do soon quieten down though. We're in Euro 5 plus land now, and once I got used to the unusually long clutch travel and appetite for revs and the slightly abrupt gear change stroke shifter in the first 3 gears, I'm on my way back home. I've heard the Diavel variously referred to as a muscle cruiser, a naked cruiser, or sometimes a power cruiser. Well, I'd agree with the muscle naked power thing, but I'm not sure if this is really a cruiser though. I suppose it all depends on your definition, but to me, a cruiser is a bike to be a bit lazy on, to relax on. There has to be some element of relaxation in the equation, doesn't there? And the Diavel doesn't encourage you to relax at all. It wants you to be full on all the time. Over the 3 days I had the bike, I don't think there was a single moment that I would have described my state of mind as being relaxed. A cruiser for me is something more like the Royal Enfield Super Meteor, or even, dare I say, a Triumph Rocket. On paper and in the flesh, the Diavel does sort of look like a rocket in that it's long and low and is very much about making a statement, but to ride they really are completely different. More on that later. No, I'd class the Diavel more as a super naked that's kind of dressed up to look cool and with a slightly more laid back riding position. The engine is a peach and feels quite different here than it did in my mate's Multistrada that I tried a couple of months ago. It's straining at the leash, urging you to twist the throttle just a little bit more. It's more savage. Now, whether you're looking for that, only you can decide. There is lots of usable power, and I found myself on more than one occasion twisting the throttle and pulling away and then trying to shift up to 6th, except that I'd been in 6th all along. Only I hadn't realised because there's so much torque available. All that being said, I rode the 1200S Diavel about 7 years ago before I started the channel, and I seem to remember it being even more visceral. The V4 has more than enough grunt, obviously, but the previous gen was even gruntier. Thanks again, Euro 5. I know looks are subjective, but I've always found the Diavel a really good looking bike. It's just aggressive enough without shouting about it, and in this black, you might even call it elegant. And how much better would it look without the license plate holder covering the rear? I know we have to have it, but I bet the Ducati designers must have been tearing their hair out when they remembered they had somehow to incorporate a number plate. There are aftermarket tail tiders available, of course, but your choice is limited on the 2025 model because of the funky light display under the seat. What do you think of the black? Personally, I think if I were fortunate enough to be ordering a new Diavel, I'd go all out and get the red. I just think, like most Ferraris, Ducatis were born to be red, but even in the black it's a looker, certainly safer than the rather Marmite aubergine offered on the X Diavel that Ducati Faro currently have in their showroom. Their sales guy told me they ordered it because it's called Black Lava, not realising that it's actually this dark purple. I'm sure someone will buy it. Perceived quality, fit and finish are generally beyond reproach, though I did feel certain parts of the front fairing, the air ducts in particular, looked and felt a little bit budget compared to the previous generation Diavel. Not cheap exactly, that would be unfair, just a bit ordinary, like the Honda Hornet 1000, except that's a €10,000 bike and this is 30,000. Otherwise the components, wheels, brakes, pedals, levers, switchgear, are all exquisitely fashioned and very pleasant to use. The switchgear is of course backlit and very intuitive, the dash is well laid out, and the menus are very nicely done. Triumph, please take note. But unlike the Multistrada with its 7-inch display, the Diavel only gets 5 inches, which in my opinion is just too small. Ripping along the motorway, the last thing I want to do is have to squint to see fuel range or ambient temperature. The X Diavel gets a wider 16:9 format dash, so maybe the standard Diavel will get this for 2026. Otherwise, sitting on the motorway, everything is effortless on my weekend loaner, a black non-X Diavel, super stable from the extra long wheelbase and fat tyres, which are prone to tramlining in the ruts however, relentless power of course for overtakes, and wind protection that isn't that bad considering there's no screen. It's better than I had on my Triumph Speed Twin 1200 for example. It's not all light and roses though. The seat is very comfortable, but the suspension is firm. Apparently you get 120mm of fork travel and 145 in the rear shock, but it doesn't really feel as if you've got that much to play with. The rather short seat to peg distance also means my knees feel bent, too bent, so I would definitely go for the optional high seat, especially as standard seat to ground height is a very manageable 790mm. This is not a tall bike. Another negative, well documented, is the engine heat. It's not really a problem when you're riding in jeans. The fabric and knee protectors block 95% of the heat, but even with these on, your inner calves get a good roasting at a red light. And when I went back down to my basement a couple of hours after leaving the bike there, the whole garage was really very warm, as if somebody had left the central heating on. The Diavel does have that cylinder deactivation thing, but it's less sophisticated than on the Multistrada, which can drop back to 2 cylinders during riding. The Diavel will only do this at a standstill and when you're in neutral. You can hear the engine note alter slightly, but you can't feel anything at all. And talking of neutral, it's pretty hard to find, like bikes used to be 20 odd years ago. I often found myself stubbornly flicking between 1 and 2 and 2 and 1, waiting for the green N on the dash. As I mentioned, the gear change is quite mechanical. I wouldn't call it clunky, but it nearly is, especially in the first 3 gears. Apologies in advance for the politically incorrect sexism, but this is very much a man's bike. The quick shifter works well, better than on a BMW Boxer for example, but not as smooth as on a Triumph. The gears are also strangely tall, and as the engine doesn't like low revs, I've found myself changing down to a lower gear sooner than I would on other bikes. It's not a problem, you get used to it and adapt to it, but the gearing is on the long side and not something that I noticed on the Multistrada. How about the Lightlock X3 test? Best U-look on the market in my opinion, but the compact dimensions that make it relatively easy to carry also mean that it doesn't fit all bikes. Well, thanks in part to the single-sided swing arm, access couldn't be easier, and fitting it through the spokes of the Diavel's rear wheel is a piece of cake. £10 off with the discount code in the description. The brakes are absolutely phenomenal. Same Brembo styler calipers as on my Triumph Tiger 900, but that's where the similarity ends. The Diavel's discs are 330mm, but they look bigger, especially on the 17-inch front wheel, which somehow manages to look too small on this bike. Same on the Rocket really, but at least on the Triumph you get a big balloon tyre that, as it were, fills out the wheel arch a bit. The best thing about the Ducati's brakes is the beefy radial master cylinder, which distills a feeling of immense but supremely dosable stopping power. Very nice indeed. Wish I had this full setup on my Tiger. That said, on my particular bike, which was coming up for its 1,000 kilometre, 600 mile service, one of the front brakes was binding and squeaking slightly, which from what I've seen in user groups does seem to be a recurring issue. How about fuel consumption? Well, maybe skip this section if you're of an eco-sensitive disposition. Official figures say 6.6 litres per 100 kilometres, but my average when I returned the bike was 7.5. And I promise I wasn't going that crazy. Okay, you get a ton of power and thrills by the bucket load, but that's pretty poor by modern standards, although, to be fair, the Triumph Rocket is even thirstier. It's all the more surprising in that the Diavel is remarkably light, 211 kilos dry, so let's say for the sake of convenience, 225 wet, the same as my Tiger 900. I say remarkably because it looks heavier than that, don't you think? But to all intents and purposes, it's a whopping 100 kilos lighter than the Rocket, and you can certainly feel this on the move. As I said, the Diavel feels like a Super Naked, even if it doesn't really look like one. So what about the Rocket 3? How does the Diavel compare? Well, in all honesty, it doesn't really. Yes, it sort of looks the same, but where the Rocket is big, long, heavy, ultra torquey, the Diavel is lithe, firm, sporty and revvy. Now, regular viewers will recall that I started this channel 6 years ago when Triumph first revealed the Rocket as a way of paying for a bike I thought I just had to have. Then a few months later I rode it and realised it was not the bike I had to have. It's too big, too heavy, too much hard work, and not as fast as you'd expect from the spec sheet. The Diavel is more up my street. It's almost as beefy as the Rocket, but so much more usable. It's more compact, lighter, faster, and I think prettier, especially the front end. Quick replies to some of the queries that you were kind enough to send in, even if I've already covered some of the points. Slightly different formats. I haven't got space physically on the screen to put all of your names, but thank you for sending in your questions, and if you want to subscribe and feature in the next video, then please do so. So first question, long distance comforts. Well, I was on a ride in the hills yesterday on my Tiger with a couple of mates, and all the way around I kept thinking, Christ, I'm glad I'm not on the Diavel. See, when the road surface is poor, as it often is in Portugal, the Diavel can be a pain, literally and metaphorically. It's a fairground ride really, not a bike I'd want to be doing hundreds of kilometers on. It's not uncomfortable in short doses, but as I said, it's not a cruiser, much less a tourer. Is it worth 30k? Back to the is any bike worth 30 grand debates that we had a few weeks ago about the Multistrada. Let's say that I'd feel more comfortable if the Diavel were in the 22 to 24,000 euro ballpark, level with the Speed Triple. The Multistrada, which is also 28-30,000, does seem to offer more money, more for the money, insofar as it's just more versatile. Next question, with such a bike, what do you need to compensate? In the late 1970s, I remember seeing a Lamborghini Countach parked outside Harrods in the centre of London with the number plate PEN 1S, which I thought was quite clever in a self-deprecating kind of way, and I think it would be quite apt here too. The Diavel is all about flexing really, isn't it? Nothing wrong with that. I enjoyed doing a bit of it over the weekend. Every day though, I'm not so sure. Number 4, how easy is it to push into and out of your garage? Not very is the answer. Surprising, as it's relatively light, I mentioned this earlier on, and it's relatively low to the ground, but I ended up sitting on it and paddling with my feet to move it around. Number 5, candidate for the next bike? It would be on 2 conditions. 1, that I could have it in red, and 2, that I was also allowed to keep my Tiger and my scooter. The Diavel is a fabulous machine, but as a second or even better, third bike. Next question, what do you feel with this bike in terms of riding experience? It's like what? Well, as you've probably gathered, I really enjoyed my 3-day fairground ride. Massive power, massive brakes and massive presence. but it's not a cruiser, it's a super naked in disguise, which is great as long as you know what you're buying. Next question, would you ride this for a good few hours in a day without suffering and for a few days on the trot? I could do either of these, but not both. What I mean is, if I rode it for a few hours in a day, like our ride in the hills yesterday, then I would probably need a few days off before I felt like riding it again. Similarly, if I rode it to work every day, fine, but only if work was 20 minutes away, or if I was 20 years younger. Next one, how do you compare it overall to the Triumph Speed Triple? Well, it's around €6,000 more expensive than the Triumph for a start. It's not as easy to ride fast, but it looks better, particularly around the front, and that fat rear tyre is something else, especially if you can somehow mount an under-seat tail tidy. Going back to the previous question about riding longer distances regularly, if that's how you use a motorcycle, then the Triumph is the wiser choice. Next question, forward or central pegs preferred? Forward pegs look as if they should be comfortable, don't they? But they're not, at least after 10 minutes. Having the pegs under your hips means that they can take some of your weight and you can use your knees as shock absorbers. I find that my lower back gets very uncomfortable after a few miles on a feet forward bike. So in this instance, the centrally pegged Diavel would definitely be my choice over the feet forward X Diavel. Next question, would you choose a Diavel over a Triumph Rocket 3? Yes. Channel name notwithstanding, I'd choose this Ducati for the reasons I've already given. The Rocket looks more mental than it actually is on the road, and I think I would probably tire of its size and weight once the novelty had worn off. The Diavel is just more fun and more usable in my opinion. And number 11, final question, when are you picking it up? Wish I knew. 2000 and never. If I win the lottery, or if this video gets, by my reckoning, about 11.5 million views, then it would definitely be in my garage, but alongside my two other normal bikes. So some final thoughts. Time to return the outrageously excessive, politically incorrect and consequently irresistible Diavel V4 to Ducati Faro, who, if you do live in southern Portugal, are nestled behind the Porsche dealership, as you'll see in a moment. Would I choose one over the Rocket? Yes, I would. It's faster, more manageable, weighing nearly 100 kilos less, even if it doesn't quite exude the unrivaled brawn of the Triumph. In a nutshell, if I had 30 grand burning a hole in my pocket, I can't think of many bikes that I'd rather treat myself to. Let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching.